There is a particular kind of tired that sleep cannot fix. You know the one. You wake up after 8 hours and feel somehow more depleted than when you went to bed. The coffee doesn't touch it. The weekend doesn't touch it. 2 weeks in Bali wouldn't touch it. Brené Brown has spent the better part of 3 decades sitting across from people who are experiencing exactly that. Researchers, nurses, teachers, parents, executives, people who, by every external measure, should be fine. And what she found over and over again was that the conversation always started the same way. I'm just really tired. But when she pressed, what emerged wasn't fatigue. It was something older and heavier. It was the accumulated weight of feelings that had never been named, never been spoken, never been allowed to exist. Feelings that had been tucked away because there was a meeting to get to, a child to pick up, a face to keep composed. Brown's research, rooted in qualitative data and thousands of hours of interviews, pointed to something the cultural conversation around burnout keeps getting wrong. We treat burnout like a workload problem, a scheduling problem, an efficiency problem. It isn't. It is an emotional problem. Specifically, it is what happens when you have spent so long suppressing what you feel that your nervous system simply stops cooperating. That is where this conversation begins. The word burnout was first coined by psychologist Herbert Freudenberger in 1974. He used it to describe the exhaustion he observed in volunteers at a free clinic who had given everything they had and then kept giving past the point of having anything left. What's worth sitting with is that Freudenberger wasn't describing people who worked too many hours. He was describing people who cared too much for too long without anywhere to put that caring. Brené Brown returned to that same thread decades later and pulled on it. Her work on vulnerability, shame, and emotional courage isn't separate from the topic of burnout. It is the diagnosis beneath the diagnosis. What follows are 3 things Brown's research illuminates about emotional exhaustion: what it actually is, how to recognize it before it becomes a crisis, and what real recovery looks like, not the kind sold on wellness retreats, but the kind that requires something genuinely uncomfortable. 1, burnout is what happens when you treat emotions like inconveniences. Brown has a phrase she returns to often: you cannot selectively numb emotion. She arrived at this through her research on numbing behaviors: alcohol, overworking, scrolling, busyness. And what she found was both obvious in hindsight and deeply counterintuitive in practice. When you numb the difficult feelings, the anxiety, the grief, the anger, the loneliness, you also numb the good ones. Joy becomes harder to access. Connection feels more distant. Meaning gets harder to locate. You are not protecting yourself from pain by suppressing it. You are just paying interest on a debt that keeps growing. Think about a version of this most people will recognize: the person who is so focused on being professional at work that they absorb criticism without processing it, absorb unfairness without naming it, absorb other people's emotions without ever addressing their own, and then cannot understand why on a Friday evening they feel like a wrung out dishcloth. That is not tiredness from output. That is the cost of continuous quiet suppression. Brown's practical implication here is simple but not easy. You have to name what you are feeling before you can move through it. Not perform feeling, not narrate it to someone on social media. Actually sit with it long enough to call it by its correct name. She draws a distinction between I feel bad and I feel shame, or I feel grief, or I feel resentful. The more specific the language, the more the nervous system can begin to metabolize it. The practice is this: once a day, before bed, or at midday, ask yourself, what am I actually carrying right now? Not what happened. Not what you think about it. What does it feel like to be you today? That question, done honestly, is more therapeutic than most people give it credit for. 2, the warning signs arrive early, and they are almost always dismissed. Brown speaks often about the stories we tell ourselves. And one of the most common stories people in the early stages of emotional burnout tell themselves is this: I'm fine. I just need to get through this stretch. The stretch, of course, never ends. The early signs of emotional exhaustion rarely look like collapse. They look like irritability that comes from nowhere. They look like cynicism about things you used to care about. They look like a flattening of curiosity. You used to want to know things, and now you just want the day to be over. They look like withdrawing from people you love, not because you're angry at them, but because you simply do not have enough left to be present with them. Brown refers to the armor people put on to get through this stage, the performance of capability, the message you send to yourself and to others that everything is under control, because admitting that it isn't feels like weakness or failure or both. But here is what her research makes plain. The armor doesn't protect you from the load. It just makes it harder to put the load down. The practical takeaway is to treat these early signs as data, not character flaws. Irritability is not you being a bad person. It is information. Withdrawal is not you being antisocial. It is a signal. When you learn to read these signs without judging them, you can intervene before the system goes dark. One concrete thing Brown suggests: pay attention to where you are on the empathy spectrum. Emotional exhaustion consistently erodes the capacity for empathy. If you notice that you have stopped being curious about other people, that their problems feel like imposition rather than invitation, that is not a personality shift. That is a symptom. Take it seriously. 3, real recovery is relational, not recreational. Here is where the conversation around burnout tends to get it most wrong. The standard prescription is rest. Take a holiday. Sleep more. Unplug. And rest matters. Brown is not arguing against it. But rest alone cannot replenish what emotional suppression has depleted. The deficit is not physical. It is relational and existential. What Brown's research consistently points to is this: the thing that most reliably restores people who are emotionally exhausted is not solitude. It is safe connection. Specifically, it is the experience of being fully seen by another person without the armor on and not being rejected for it. This is why people come back from a week of vacation and feel fine for about 3 days before the exhaustion returns. The vacation ad dressed the depletion, but not the source of the depletion. Real recovery in Brown's framework involves 2 things. The first is finding 1 or 2 relationships where you can be honest, where you can say, I am not doing well, without bracing for the consequences, not to be fixed, not to be advised, just to be witnessed. The second is examining the systems and expectations you have accepted without question. Emotional exhaustion almost always has an external component, a culture, a role, a dynamic that is asking more of you than is sustainable. Rest does not change that. Honest examination does. The practical work here is harder than booking a massage, and that is precisely the point. Ask yourself, where am I performing composure that I do not feel? And who, if anyone, knows the real answer to that question? If the answer to the second question is no one, that is where to start. Brené Brown once described vulnerability as the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. She did not say it was comfortable. She said it was necessary. Emotional exhaustion is in many ways what happens when we refuse that birthplace for too long, when we keep the gates closed because the world has taught us that open gates are dangerous. And for many people, in many contexts, that learning was entirely rational. The armor made sense once, but armor is heavy, and the cost of carrying it is not paid all at once. It is paid in small daily withdrawals. A little less patience here, a little less joy there, until one day you look up and realize the account is empty. Recovery is not dramatic. It does not arrive in one conversation or one retreat or one good night of sleep. It arrives slowly through the practice of naming what you actually feel, recognizing the early signals before they become crises, and finding at least one place in your life where you do not have to pretend. That is where you begin. If something in this video landed for you, if you recognized yourself in the early warning signs or in the armor, leave a comment below. Specifically, tell me this. What is one feeling you have been carrying that you have not yet given a name to? You don't have to explain it. Just name it. That alone is a start. And if this kind of conversation is useful to you, subscribe. New videos go up regularly. And they are all built around the same idea, that understanding yourself more clearly is never wasted time. This channel is not affiliated with Brené Brown or any of her official representatives. The content you just watched is educational in nature, inspired by the publicly available teachings, writings, and interviews of Brené Brown. It does not constitute professional advice. Before making any major decision in this area, please do your own research and consult a qualified professional.